Hello, folks. I'm excited to interview the author of the new book, The Intimate Alien, The Hidden Story of the UFO, David Halperin. Good to see you today.
Great to see you, Martin.
David Halperin is a retired professor of religious studies from the University of North Carolina, and you were going to have a book launch at Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, but because of the coronavirus, it's been delayed. So you were kind enough to let me interview you live here because I was excited to come, and I've come up with a number of questions that I've written up here, and I would like to go through them with you if you're amenable to it and learn a little bit more about this great book.
Let's go.
David, can you tell me what is that hidden story of the UFO?
Well, Martin, the hidden story is essentially a human story. Because what I say in my book is that UFOs have nothing at all to do with space travel. They've got nothing at all to do with life on other planets. What they're about is us humans. They're about our longings. They're about our terrors. Most especially, they're about the greatest terror of all, the end of our existence.
So the skeptics that say there aren't such things as UFOs, are they right?
Well, they're right about the less important issue. They're right to say that as physical machines from Alpha Centauri or whatever, there are no such things as UFOs. But they're wrong about the more important issue. And here, the people who believe in UFOs, who swear by them, are right. And that is that UFOs are an enormously important subject. Also, enormously mysterious, that require our investigation. And if you say, well, if they're just about us humans, how can they be mysterious? Let's say there is enough mystery inside this skull and inside our human skulls to fill a whole universe.
On the outside jacket, it says UFOs are a myth and myths are real. Is that right?
Yeah, I mean, we normally think of a myth. If you call something a myth, it's like saying it's not true, it's not real. Now, what's really interesting is about 60 years ago, two books on UFOs came out at about almost the same time, and they had almost the same titles, but were making almost opposite points. One of them was by an astrophysicist named Donald Menzel, and it was called The World of Flying Saucers, an examination of a major myth of the space age. And the other was by the psychologist Carl Jung. He published it originally in German 3 years before he died in 1961. And he called it Flying Saucers, a modern myth of things seen in the skies. But what those two men meant by myth was almost the exact opposite. To Menzel, myth meant bunk, nonsense, or at least something that's not true. Whereas to Jung, myth is a kind of collective dream of the human species, bringing out in symbolic form truths about ourselves, truths that we need to recognize. So when Jung said the UFOs are a modern myth, he didn't mean, oh, it's a bunch of hooey. What he meant is, look, folks, we've got a myth as true and as profound as any Greek myth, as any Indian myth, developing right in front of our eyes and using the trappings of the space age and yet it's as real and as true as any of these myths. Attention must be paid. And that's the tradition that I follow in when I speak of UFOs as myths.
Sometimes people call UFOs a religion or a cult. What do you think about that?
Well, I think if the labeling of UFOs as a religion is used as a way of disparaging them, it's completely wrong and completely inappropriate. But I think that same adjective can be applied in a much more respectful way. To say that insofar as a UFO encounter is something beyond a simple misinterpretation of something in the sky, to the extent to which there is something more powerful involved in it, it is a bona fide religious experience. And the lore of the UFO, which encompasses all sorts of extraordinary things like the Roswell crash and the Men in Black, that the lore of the UFO is a religious myth, which makes the collective dream accessible even to those who haven't been blessed by a direct encounter with it. And I think in that sense, UFOs are a religious phenomenon. And I would say that my training as a scholar of religion has given me many of the tools I need to understand them.
A quote from the book is a UFO encounter is a religious experience. Could you expound on that?
Well, I can best answer that question with an example. And it's an example about a very famous person, John Lennon, the ex-Beatle. Now, most of the people who are watching this have certainly heard of John Lennon. Probably most of them don't know that he had an encounter with a UFO in August of 1974. At the time, he was separated from his wife, Yoko Ono, and was living in a Manhattan penthouse apartment with his girlfriend, former assistant, May Pang. And he described, both he and May Pang have described in multiple interviews how, as she was coming out of the shower, she heard John, who was, as he often did, walking around the apartment naked, calling out, May, come out here. And you have to realize this is an August evening. The day has been very hot, very sultry. Now it's cooling off, and they've opened the windows, the sliding doors to their balcony, and May comes running out, dropping the towel, running out onto the balcony, and they see a dome disk passing overhead, maybe a couple 100 feet away from them. This is what the ufologists would call a close encounter of the first kind. Now, they have a camera, and they fetch it and take a number of photos of this UFO. When the photos are developed, they show nothing. Because there's nothing to be seen, nothing to be photographed. The UFO comes from inside. And what's really interesting is that both John and May see it. Now, what is involved there? What's happened there? What interests me is that in nearly all of the interviews with both John and with May, they mention I was nude, he was nude, then their nakedness keeps recurring as a part of the story. Now, if they are just passive witnesses of something happening in the sky, why is it important that they're naked? But now I would ask everybody who's watching this, when was the last time a naked human couple stood before a numinous presence? And I think many of them will be able to answer in the Garden of Eden, as described in the 3rd chapter of Genesis, when Adam hears the voice of the Lord God walking in the garden in the cool of the day, the same time that the Lennon Pang sighting happened. And he calls out to him, Adam, where art thou? And Adam says, I heard thy voice in the garden, and I was naked, and I hid myself. The nakedness of Adam and Eve before this numinous presence is a vital part of the Genesis story. And it's reenacted completely unconsciously. John Lennon was not a Bible believer by a long shot. He and his girlfriend reenact this archetypal scene, but with the numinous presence in the form of what Jung would call a mandala, a disc-shaped object, rather than the human form God of Genesis. This seems to me a clear example of a UFO sighting, a UFO encounter, as a spontaneous religious experience coming from something hardwired in us as human beings.
I have a few more questions.
I'm all ready.
So the UFO doesn't just happen in the sky. The witnesses are part of the experience. Is that right?
Absolutely. The witnesses are part of it, and I think it's even broader. Anyone who retells the experience becomes part of it. Anyone who believes in it becomes part of it. Those who deny it and who ridicule it and who say, in the case of John Lennon, say, oh, what were they on? That all of them are part of the experience. That the UFO experience includes the spacey enthusiasm that it evokes. It also includes the knee-jerk ridicule and sometimes almost savage hostility that it evokes. Because I feel this strongly, that the UFO debunker is as emotionally engaged with the UFO as the believer, only with a minus sign attached rather than a plus sign.
Well, that is just so fascinating, because stories let us be part of something without physically endangering our lives.
Yes, yes, that we do not all, and that's what I meant by saying that UFO lore is a religious myth. We do not all have to be prophets in order to experience the spiritual, I won't say benefits, because they're not always benefits, but the spiritual blowback of the religion.
One of the UFO stories that we've all heard about is the crash at Roswell, New Mexico. Do you talk about this in the book?
Oh, I have a chapter on it, Martin. And I see that as absolutely pivotal. And let's see, I don't want to go into too much detail. It's a very complicated story. But let us say that it erupts right after the beginning of the modern UFO era in the summer of 1947. The UFO era began when a private pilot named Kenneth Arnold saw 9 shining objects going over the Cascade Mountains of Washington, like saucers skipping over water. That was his image. And the press turned that into flying saucers. About 2 weeks after Arnold's experience, on the 8th of July, 1947, the public information officer at Roswell Army Airfield in New Mexico proudly announced that the intelligence office of their group had retrieved a landed disc. It's interesting, he didn't say crashed, he said landed. And that the disc was being shipped to higher authorities in Fort Worth for examination. That was early on the afternoon of July 8th. Late on that afternoon, the higher authorities in Fort Worth declared that the whole thing was nothing but a weather balloon. And the incident, and this is something most people don't realize, the incident slid into obscurity, forgotten by nearly everyone. For the next 30 years, no one would hear about Roswell. And then in 1978, it reemerged, this time with a new detail, crucial, that was not part of the original Roswell story, and that is that the disc had crashed and the bodies of small alien entities were found in it. And it's in that form that the Roswell myth spread over the world. Now, what is that myth about?
Mm-hmm.
I would say the myth is about death.
Mm-hmm.
I've written at one point that the Greeks imagined that the gods were immortal. The ufologists know better. Greek mythology missed out on that one. And the UFO myth recognizes that even the gods or the godlike beings that in our pride we imagine ourselves to be are mortal. At bottom, I think the UFO is about death, the ultimate alien that we cannot imagine. Try to imagine yourself being dead.
Right.
You can't, and I can't either. At the same time, it's an alien that's born with us and grows up with us, that shares our space every day of our lives. The intimate alien. And that's what my book is about.
On that note, because I've just got it, would you be kind enough to read something from the new book?
Okay, this is the beginning of chapter 1. It's called Confessions of a Teenage Ufologist, which is there because I was, before I became a professor of religious studies, I was in the 1960s a teenage ufologist. And my story is the starting point of understanding, my understanding of other people's stories. So here's the beginning of my story. I became a ufologist in October of 1960. I was 12 going on 13. I was in 8th grade. I'd just become interested in girls. Or rather, I'd just become aware of my interest in girls, since I'd previously managed to persuade myself that my fascination with a beautiful, brown-eyed and brown-haired, prematurely voluptuous 7th grade classmate was pure platonic friendship. It helped that this girl was also a very nice person. Her name was Barbara. Anything other than platonic friendship would have unsettled my mother, who was housebound with a heart condition and slowly dying, although I didn't know that, or I didn't know I knew it.
Wow. What a tone to set your passion for UFOs and exploring it. And I can see how that could lead to, from there to the religious studies, to looping all the way back to the creation of this great book.
Martin, this is a book I've been writing for the past 55 years. I was originally going to call it The Flying Saucer Mystery when I was 15 years old. Now I've picked a somewhat different title for it, but it's still, I would say, the book around which my life has developed.
What do the UFOs teach us now that we're confronted with the coronavirus, which is a global crisis?
The most basic meaning of the UFO is that intimate alien, death. It makes sense that they should become a cultural phenomenon at a time when a new sort of death emerges into the world, the death of the entire human species. This is June 1947. This was the same month that the doomsday clock first appeared on the bulletin of the atomic scientists. Now, one thing that has struck me is that in the past few years, UFOs have seen an absolutely amazing renaissance as a cultural phenomenon. The august New York Times is now unabashedly pro-UFO, which is just incredible. And my intuition tells me, and I cannot prove this, that this is connected with the 2016 election and with our awareness, which became more acute with that election and with Donald Trump's withdrawal from the Paris Accords, that we may now face another kind of mass death connected with climate change. Now, all of a sudden, I mean, we could have seen it coming, but we didn't. We are socked with nature turning wild, turning against us, bringing us a death that we find ourselves not quite able to respond to. So I think that the UFO will take on new shapes now that this trauma of the coronavirus is upon us. What these new shapes will be during the time of the pandemic and after the pandemic has left its scars on us and our society, I do not know. Let's watch and see.
How can they get a copy of this book? This is fantastic. And I have to tell you, it's a beautiful cover as well. It feels good to hold. I know that's, an odd statement, but it's such an enjoyable book to hold.
And I want to thank you, Rob Ehle. I don't know quite how you pronounce his name. It's E-H-L-E. He's the artist who did that gorgeous cover. And I am so grateful to him. The book is published by Stanford University Press, and you can obtain it from the publisher on their website, or you can obtain it from Flyleaf Books in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. This is the bookstore where we were going to have the gala launch of it. Circumstances have interfered. We're postponing the launch, but you can still get it by mail order from Flyleaf Books, and we hope they'll be reopening very, very soon.
Excellent. Thank you so much for the time. This was fantastic. I highly recommend digging into this. This is, as you said, a lifetime in the making and a wonderful book to enjoy. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. It's good to talk to you.